My name is Joseph Callahan, and for most of my life, people mistook my silence for weakness. Maybe it was because I never raised my voice, or because I preferred fixing what was broken instead of talking about it. Or maybe it was because I stayed home when everyone else left. I grew up on a patch of land that smelled like earth and rain, 30 acres of stubborn soil and old oaks, the kind of place that teaches you patience before you even know what the word means. My father, Samuel Callahan, used to say, "The land remembers who shows up." I didn't understand that when I was a boy. But now, years later, I know exactly what he meant. Because in the end, the land and the man remembered me. My 2 siblings, Mark and Elena, left home as soon as they could. Mark became some kind of regional manager for a logistics company in Atlanta, always talking about numbers and margins like they were gospel. Elena married a man who wore too much cologne and liked to say things like, "You can't grow if you don't leave." They'd visit on holidays, maybe once a year, bringing gifts they didn't remember to remove the price tags from. Meanwhile, I stayed. I stayed when Dad's hands began to shake too much to button his shirt. I stayed when the barn roof caved in after a storm, and no one answered my calls for help. I stayed when he forgot where he was halfway through his sentences and looked at me like I was a stranger. At first, I told myself it was duty. Then I realized it was love, the kind that doesn't need to shout or prove anything. The house changed over time. Once filled with voices and dinners that stretched into stories, it became quiet. You start noticing things when a house goes quiet: the hum of the refrigerator, the sigh of old wood, the slow ticking of a clock that somehow feels louder after sunset. Dad would sit by the window most evenings, the same chair he'd used since I was a child. His eyes followed the sun until it dropped behind the trees. "Your mother used to say that was God turning the lights out gentle," he'd whisper. I'd nod, even if I'd heard it 100 times before. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me with this strange mix of sadness and pride. Once he said, "You've got your mother's patience, son. That's rarer than gold." But patience wears thin when love feels one-sided. Because every month, like clockwork, I'd get a call from Mark or Elena. Not to ask how Dad was doing, but to ask how the property was holding up. "How's the old place looking?" Mark would say. "Still worth something, right?" Or Elena, laughing softly, "Joseph, you know you could sell that land and actually live a little." I'd tell them the same thing every time, that it wasn't about money, that some things can't be sold. And they'd sigh, as if I were some kind of relic holding on to sentiment instead of sense. But what they never understood was that real love doesn't earn interest. It just earns peace. I remember one particular night, about 3 years before Dad passed. The rain was beating against the tin roof, and thunder rolled over the hills like something alive. Dad was in his room, restless. I heard him calling my name, voice weak, trembling. When I rushed in, he was half awake, eyes glazed. "Joseph, make sure they don't take it from you," he said. "Take what, Dad?" I asked, holding his hand. "The home," he whispered. "The land. It belongs to whoever keeps it alive." I thought he was rambling, lost in the fog that sometimes swallowed him at night. But those words, "whoever keeps it alive," stuck with me. The next morning he was clear-headed again, as if nothing had happened. But I started noticing small things after that. A sealed envelope in his desk drawer with my name on it. Papers he asked me to sign as witness, legal-looking documents, full of fine print I didn't fully understand. He said, "Just in case I forget, son, this will remember for me." I didn't ask questions. I just trusted him. Over time, the house became less a home and more a hospital. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the scent of coffee I brewed every morning. His medicines lined the kitchen counter like little soldiers. I'd read to him, shave him, walk him to the porch so he could feel the morning air on his face. Sometimes he'd hum an old hymn, his voice frail but warm. and I'd hum along. That's what love looked like in those years, quiet, consistent, invisible to everyone but the two people living it. Then came the end. It was a Sunday morning, the kind that looked too peaceful for grief. The sky was soft blue, and the air smelled of lilac. I found him in his chair by the window, the sunlight resting on his face like a final blessing. His eyes were open, but he wasn't there anymore. I didn't cry right away. I just sat beside him, holding his hand until it went cold. The funeral was small, a handful of old friends, a few neighbors, and my siblings, who arrived in black suits and sunglasses as if grief were a performance. They hugged me, told me I'd done the right thing staying behind, and then spent most of the service talking about logistics. After the burial, Mark clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You've been a good son, Joe. Dad would have been proud. Now let's make sure we handle things fairly." Fairly. That word rang like a warning bell in my head. 2 weeks later, I received a call from Dad's attorney, Mr. Williams, asking us to meet for the reading of the will. I wasn't nervous, just tired. I assumed Dad had left the property to all three of us. That would have been fair. We gathered in the old oak-paneled office downtown. Mr. Williams, a man with a silver mustache and voice like gravel, sat behind his desk, adjusting his glasses. Mark leaned back in his chair, confident, already calculating. Elena crossed her legs, her perfume too sweet for the room. I sat quietly, hands folded, heart steady. Mr. Williams cleared his throat and began reading. "To my son Mark, I leave my watch, may it remind you that time is more valuable than titles. To my daughter Elena, I leave your mother's piano, may you one day learn the beauty of consistency. And to my son Joseph," he paused, looking at me with eyes that softened, "I leave the Callahan estate, the land, the home, and all associated properties, as they have already been transferred into his name." Mark blinked. "Wait, what? Asterisk." Mr. Williams repeated it, calm as stone. "The transfers were finalized 4 years ago. Your father arranged it personally." Elena laughed, sharp and disbelieving. "You're joking. That can't be right." But the attorney slid a folder across the desk, full of deeds and signatures. My father's handwriting, my own initials as witness. It all came rushing back those quiet evenings when Dad had asked me to sign. Mark's voice cracked. "He tricked us. He tricked me." "No," I said quietly. "He trusted me." The room went still. Elena slammed her purse shut, eyes cold. "So you just sat here all these years, playing caretaker, waiting for this?" I met her gaze. "I didn't wait for anything. I showed up." Mark stood, jaw tight. "You manipulated him. You took advantage while we were working our asses off." I shook my head slowly. "You were working for yourselves. I was working for him." Mr. Williams cleared his throat again. "Your father's instructions were clear. Loyalty signs documents when no one is watching." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the rustle of papers being gathered. As I walked out of that office, I realized something. Justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in the steady hand of a man who saw who was truly there. And yet I knew this wasn't the end. Because when envy meets truth, peace rarely follows. They say silence is peaceful, but that's only half the truth. The other half, the one no one writes about, is that silence can cut. It can fill a room so thick that every breath feels like an admission of guilt. After the will reading, I drove home alone. The old Ford rattled over gravel roads, each bump echoing in my chest. The envelope with the deeds sat on the passenger seat, heavy as if it carried the weight of every year I'd spent in that house. The sun was low, spilling gold over the fields, but I couldn't feel any warmth. I kept replaying my siblings' faces, the disbelief, the rage, the accusation. You manipulated him. You took advantage. You waited for this. Each word landed like a bruise. When I reached the farmhouse, the porch light flickered same bulb that had been blinking for months. Dad used to say he liked the flicker because it reminded him life was still moving, even when it looked still. I left it that way. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and coffee grounds. The chair by the window was still there, untouched since the funeral. I sat in it. The wood creaked like an old friend sighing. That night, I didn't sleep. I just listened. The refrigerator hummed. The wind pressed against the window. Somewhere outside, an owl called into the dark 3 soft hoots. When I was a boy, Dad said owls carried messages between worlds. Maybe that's why I whispered, I didn't mean for it to be this way. The next morning, I found a text from Mark. You think you deserve everything? You don't. You'll regret this. Then one from Elena. You disgust me. Enjoy your land of ghosts. I didn't reply. I didn't have the words, and even if I did, they'd twist them like they always had. Instead, I made coffee, black and strong. The kitchen window fogged as the steam rose. Outside, the fields glistened with dew. I could almost see Dad standing near the fence, that old flannel jacket he refused to throw away, waving for me to bring him another cup. I walked out, coffee in hand, just to feel the morning like we used to. The ground was cool under my boots. A crow perched on the fence post, staring at me like it knew something. Funny how the world looks the same after everything changes. Later that week, I went through Dad's old belongings. Every drawer held a piece of him: cufflinks, pocket knives, faded Polaroids. I found an old notebook tucked between the Bible and his reading glasses. On the first page, in his handwriting, were the words, "To live for others is to build a home inside your own soul." I don't know how long I sat there staring at that sentence, but when I finally closed the book, my eyes were wet. That evening, I received a call from my neighbor, Mrs. Hunt, who'd known us since I was a kid. "Joseph, honey," she said softly, "I saw your brother earlier. He didn't look too pleased. You holding up all right?" "I'm fine," I lied. She hesitated. "You know, your father was proud of you. Don't let them make you forget that." Her words lingered like incense, comforting, but bittersweet. It was the winter of 2018, the year Dad's lungs began to fail him. Snow fell heavy that year, so thick it buried the fence lines. We were trapped for days. He'd sit near the fire, coughing, his hands trembling as he held his mug. "Should have let them take me to one of those fancy care homes," he rasped once. I shook my head. "You're not dying in a room with strangers." He smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn. Just like your mother." Those were the days I learned what exhaustion truly meant: nights spent setting alarms for his medication, mornings spent chopping wood with frozen fingers. But I also learned something else: the quiet dignity of showing up, even when no one thanks you. Sometimes, in those moments, I'd imagine Mark's penthouse or Elena's warm house in the city. I'd wonder if they ever thought of us, if they knew how it felt to pour soup for someone who can no longer lift a spoon. But then Dad would squeeze my hand and whisper, "You're doing right, son," and that was enough to silence the noise. The weeks after the will were heavy. Rumors started swirling in town. Someone told someone else. That I'd talked the old man into signing everything over. It spread fast. Small towns thrive on whispers more than facts. At the gas station, I overheard 2 men talking near the counter. "You hear about old Sam's boy? Got the whole place. Guess it pays to stick around." Yeah, or maybe he just knew how to play it smart. I pretended not to hear. But my hands trembled when I paid for the fuel. Loyalty doesn't trend. It doesn't defend itself. It just stands there while people rewrite the story. Mark showed up one afternoon, unannounced. He didn't knock. He never did. He just walked in like the house still belonged to him. You know, I talked to a lawyer, he started. Dad wasn't in his right mind when he signed those papers. We could challenge this. You can try, I said quietly. But you'll be fighting his signature, not mine. He paced the kitchen, jaw tight. You always were his favorite. That's not true. He laughed bitterly. Yeah? Then why didn't he trust us? I didn't answer. Because deep down, I knew why they'd stopped showing up years ago. Mark pointed a finger at me. You think this makes you better than us? Some kind of saint. No, I said. Just someone who stayed. He left without saying goodbye, the door slamming hard enough to shake the picture frames. I stood there staring at the empty doorway, heart pounding. That's when the loneliness hit, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being misunderstood. That night, I dreamed of my father again. He was young, strong, laughing as he fixed a gate. You can't fix people, Joseph, he said, hammering a nail. You can only fix what's willing to hold. When I woke, the room was still dark, but I felt lighter somehow. Maybe because for the first time, I realized I didn't owe them my silence anymore. It was Dad's 75th birthday. I'd baked a pie my mother's recipe and cleaned the house from top to bottom. He was excited. You think they'll come this year? He asked. They said they would, I told him, smiling even though I knew better. We waited. The clock ticked. The pie cooled. The candles melted halfway down. They never came. At 8 o'clock, Dad looked at me, eyes glistening. Guess it's just us, son. I lit the candles anyway. Then we'll make a wish, just us. He laughed softly. What should we wish for? Peace, I said. Peace, he repeated, blowing out the flames. Now, years later, I realize that's what he left me, not money, not land, but peace. A peace I had to earn through pain. As the weeks passed, something inside me began to change. I stopped checking my phone for messages. I stopped trying to justify myself. Instead, I focused on restoring the farm, replacing broken boards, clearing the brush, repainting the porch. Every repair felt symbolic, like I was rebuilding not just the house but myself. Then, one morning, I received a certified letter. A lawsuit. My siblings were contesting the will. I remember laughing not because it was funny, but because it was inevitable. I folded the letter neatly, set it on the kitchen table, and whispered, "All right. If it's a war they want, I'll give them one. But not the kind they expect. Because revenge isn't always about anger. Sometimes it's about clarity." And that clarity was beginning to form like a storm on the horizon. I always believed the worst kind of loneliness was sitting beside someone who couldn't see you. But I was wrong. The worst kind is being accused by the very people you once loved for the kindness you gave them freely. The lawsuit was proof enough. A thick envelope of betrayal wrapped in legal jargon. They weren't just questioning the inheritance, they were questioning my integrity, my memory, my years of care. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter for an hour. The coffee beside me went cold. Outside, the wind swayed the trees, whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. I thought of my father again. His trembling hands. His fading eyes. The way he'd reach for me even when he didn't remember my name. And then I thought of Mark and Elena, perfectly capable, perfectly distant. A slow heat began to rise in my chest. Not the kind that burns, but the kind that clarifies. That night, I walked out to the old barn. The wood smelled of dust and hay, the same scent that had followed me since childhood. I leaned against the post and let the silence wrap around me. "This is what they wanted," I whispered. "For me to fold. To feel ashamed for doing right." I kicked at the dirt, hard enough to send pebbles skittering. I wasn't a man who yelled. I'd learned long ago that anger wastes breath. But something inside me broke open that night, quiet but final. I looked up at the rafters and said out loud, "All right, Dad. I hear you now. Time to stop fixing fences for people who burn bridges." That was the moment everything changed. Word of the lawsuit spread like spilled oil, slow at first, then unstoppable. In a small town, truth is optional. Gossip is currency. The cashier at the feed store stopped making small talk. The pastor's wife, who once asked me to fix the church steps, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Even Mrs. Hunt hesitated when I waved across the road. It was subtle, but I felt it everywhere, a tightening, a turning. So I did what my father taught me. I got quiet, observant, calculating. I began to document everything, every phone call, every letter, every memory I could verify. Not for them. For myself. Because I knew how easily people rewrite stories once the truth starts hurting them. Mr. Williams, my father's attorney, called me in. His office smelled of leather and old paper. "Joseph," he said, "I've seen families torn apart over less. Are you sure you want to fight this?" I nodded. They started the fight. He leaned back, studying me. "You've got every legal right. But justice in court doesn't always look like justice in life." "Then I'll take both," I said. "One in the courtroom, and one in the court of conscience." He smiled faintly. "Your father would have liked that." I could feel something shifting in me, not anger, but precision. A clarity sharper than grief. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. But I wouldn't fight dirty. I'd fight smart. I started revisiting every memory like evidence in a case. The times Mark refused to visit because Dad's house smelled like old age. The calls Elena ignored because she was too busy managing her kids' schedules. The Christmas when I sent them photos of Dad in his chair beside the tree, and neither of them replied. Each recollection wasn't just pain, it was proof. Proof that love had receipts. And then something strange happened. I stopped feeling sorry for myself. I started feeling awake. For the first time in years, I looked around the property not as a caretaker, but as its rightful steward. I saw opportunity in every acre they'd dismissed as dead land. The fields were dry, yes. The barn was old, yes. But beneath the neglect, there was potential buried like a seed waiting for rain. And that's when the idea came to me. If they wanted to treat me like the poor fool who stayed behind, I'd show them what staying behind really meant. I called an old friend, Tom Reyes, who'd once worked construction with me before his back gave out. He was now part of the county zoning board. "Tom, you still remember that land survey from Dad's place?" I asked. "Sure do," he said. "Why?" "I want to see if the southern acres qualify for commercial zoning. Thinking of starting something new." He whistled softly. "You serious, Joe? That land's been idle for years." "Yeah," I said. "But it's not idle anymore." Within a week, I had the permits. Within 2, I had meetings lined up with local developers. I wasn't selling the land, not yet. I was leveraging it, turning what they saw as inheritance into investment. Meanwhile, I kept every move quiet. Silence had always been my weapon. Now it became my shield. I'd visit the lawyer's office, sign forms, meet contractors, all while Mark and Elena kept throwing accusations my way. They thought they were burying me in paperwork. They didn't realize they were giving me time, and in that time, I was building. One evening, I heard a car door slam outside. Elena's voice carried before I even saw her. "Joseph!" I stepped onto the porch. She was dressed sharp as ever, pearl earrings, manicured hands clutching her phone like a sword. "Can we talk?" she said. "About what?" "About fixing this before it goes too far." I motioned for her to sit. She didn't. She took a breath. Look, maybe we said things we shouldn't have. But this lawsuit, it's gotten ugly. The family's reputation. I laughed softly. Reputation? You're worried about that now. Her jaw tightened. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I said quietly. I made it easier than it ever should have been. 4 years. She looked around, eyes softening. For a moment as they landed on the old rocking chair by the door. I miss him, she whispered. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then she said, you know, he wasn't thinking clearly those last few years. If you just agree to divide things evenly, we can all move on. And there it was, the truth beneath the performance. I already divided things evenly, I said. You got your lives. I got his legacy. Her eyes narrowed. You'll regret this. No, I replied. You will. Because you keep trying to rewrite what loyalty already wrote. She turned and left, her car disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. I stood there, heart steady, knowing the line had been drawn. That night, I went through the deeds again. My father's signature stared back at me, bold and certain. It wasn't ink anymore, it was prophecy. And as I looked at his handwriting, I realized something powerful. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about memory. He had seen through them years before I did. He'd known that loyalty had to be protected even from family. So I made a decision. I wouldn't just win this case. I'd prove the truth so clearly that even the town would have to look in the mirror. 2 weeks later, I stood in the courthouse lobby waiting for my hearing. The walls smelled of disinfectant and old paper. My reflection stared back at me from the polished floor, tired eyes, calm face. Mark walked in wearing a navy suit and arrogance. He glanced at me and smirked. You sure you want to do this in public? I met his gaze. Yes, because truth deserves a witness. He scoffed. You're still the same naive fool. Maybe, I said. But I'm the fool Dad trusted. We were called in. The courtroom was small, but packed. Neighbors, reporters, even the pastor. Everyone wanted a spectacle. The hearing was procedural, but it felt like a trial of character. Their lawyer painted me as a manipulator. Mine, Mr. Williams, calmly presented evidence. Medical records showing Dad's full lucidity during the signing, letters he'd written in his own hand. Every line spoke louder than any argument. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, I walked out not feeling triumphant, but clear. The storm had finally broken, and I was no longer the man standing in the rain. That night, I drove home under a sky split by lightning. The air smelled of iron and wet soil. I parked by the field, stepped out, and let the rain hit my face. I whispered into the dark, I'm done apologizing for staying. In that moment, I wasn't a caretaker or a victim. I was a man reclaiming his narrative. Because loyalty, when betrayed, doesn't die. It evolves. And mine had just learned how to fight back. The night after the first court hearing, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fireplace, the flames reflecting in my coffee cup like small explosions. Every crack of burning wood sounded like punctuation to the words I'd swallowed for years: unfair, ungrateful, unkind. I'd kept peace for so long. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have a pulse that wasn't apologizing. As I watched the fire dance, a thought came to me: you can't lose what was never yours, but you can reclaim what was always meant for you. That thought changed everything. The next morning, I found myself walking the boundaries of the land past the pond, over the small hill, through the line of sycamores that separated our property from the county road. Each corner of that land held a memory. Near the pond, Dad once taught me to fish. He'd say, the water doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you earn. Under the sycamores, I'd buried my first dog, Buddy, when I was 12. Dad stood beside me in the rain and said, "This is what loyalty costs, son, your heart, over and over again." I hadn't understood it back then, but walking that same line now, I realized the land wasn't just inheritance, it was testimony. Every blade of grass was witness to the years I'd stayed when everyone else left. And yet, they wanted to take it. To erase it. To rewrite decades of devotion into a convenient story of manipulation. That morning, something hardened in me like wet cement setting in the sun. I decided I wasn't going to just defend myself. I was going to expose them not through rage, but through truth too strong to deny. I started small. A quiet rebellion. While they were busy posting photos of their vacations and meetings, I was learning the system. I met with financial advisors, land consultants, and an agricultural tech firm from Nashville that specialized in sustainable conversion, turning unused farmland into renewable energy zones. The more I learned, the more I saw how much power loyalty actually held when it was paired with intelligence. At night, I'd sit with maps spread across the kitchen table, topography charts, zoning grids, and mineral rights records. The air smelled of ink, paper, and black coffee. Every line I traced was a step toward liberation. Every plan I wrote down was a small act of defiance against the version of me they'd built in their heads, the naive brother who stayed behind because he had nothing better to do. If they could see me now, they'd choke on their arrogance. But I didn't do it for revenge. I did it for clarity, to prove that love, when built on patience, becomes strategy. The town's whispers grew louder as the case dragged on. Some called me the inheritance thief. Others said I'd bewitched the old man. I let them talk. Because talkers rarely act, and I was done talking. One afternoon, as I was loading supplies into my truck, Sheriff Mathers stopped by. He'd known my father for 40 years. He leaned on the door and said, "You know, Joe, people can't stand a story where the quiet one wins." I smiled faintly. "Then they'll just have to get used to it." He grinned. "You're your father's son. That's for damn sure." After he drove off, I stood there for a long time, letting his words sink in. "You're your father's son." It wasn't just pride. It was permission. Permission to fight back, not with fists, but with faith sharpened into proof. A few days later, Mr. Williams called me to his office again. His secretary, an older woman with kind eyes, handed me an envelope. "Your father left this one sealed," she said. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Joseph, if you're reading this, it means they're already trying to make you doubt yourself. Don't. I've seen their hearts long before you did. This land isn't payment. It's a covenant. You kept it alive when no one else cared. That's what this place needs, not owners, but stewards. When the time comes, don't let anger guide you. Let evidence do the talking. The truth always remembers who carried it the longest. Love, Dad." The paper smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, his scent. My throat tightened as I folded it back into the envelope. That letter wasn't just comfort. It was strategy disguised as affection. And I knew exactly what to do next. I spent weeks collecting documents, property records, signed witnesses, dated photos of me maintaining the land, even medical notes from Dad's doctor confirming his full cognitive ability during the property transfer. Each document went into a labeled folder. Each folder became a brick in the foundation of justice. At night, when I spread them across the table, it looked less like paperwork and more like a portrait of loyalty painted in ink and dates. I also reached out to a man named Dean Ellis, an investigator I'd known back when I did part-time work for the county years ago. He had a reputation for uncovering truths people paid to bury. "Dean," I said when we met at a diner, "I need to prove something that's already true." He raised an eyebrow. "That's my favorite kind of job." I slid him a small stack of papers. "Find anything that proves my father was competent, lucid, and deliberate in those last years. Emails, witness accounts, even grocery receipts if you can." He chuckled. "You got it. But I have to ask, what's your endgame here, Joseph?" I took a sip of coffee. "Peace. But I'm willing to go through war to get it." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's give truth a microphone." As weeks turned into months, I began to see something poetic in all of it, how betrayal, when left to ferment, turns into wisdom. I stopped resenting my siblings. I started observing them. Their desperation. Their fear of losing face. Their sudden concern for a father they hadn't bothered to call for years. The lawsuit had forced them into the open. Their own greed was the witness I'd been waiting for. And deep down, I realized I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted to let them destroy themselves slowly, publicly, inevitably. One night, I stood in front of the mirror, studying my reflection. The man looking back wasn't the caretaker anymore. He was the executor of truth. Calm, patient, unshakable. "I forgive you," I whispered, not to them, but to myself, for wasting so much time waiting for people to see what was right in front of them. And for the first time in months, I slept. Then came the day Mark and Elena asked for a family meeting. I agreed, curious to see what angle they'd try next. We met at the diner in town, the same one Dad used to take us to when we were kids. The smell of frying bacon and burnt coffee clung to the air. Mark started first. "We don't want this to go public, Joseph. The court dates, the press, it's bad for everyone." Elena nodded, feigning calm. "If you just agree to sell the land and split the money 3 ways, we can end all this quietly." I stirred my coffee slowly. "You think this is about money?" "Of course it is," Mark said, leaning forward. "What else could it be?" I looked at him, really looked at the man who once shared my childhood, now blinded by greed so thick it had erased memory. "This is about loyalty," I said. "Something you can't divide into shares." He scoffed. "You're making yourself the victim again." I smiled faintly. "No. I'm making myself the witness." They exchanged a glance. Elena's eyes darted away first. "I'll see you in court," I said, standing. "But this time, bring your conscience, not your lawyers." I left them there, staring at the door as it closed behind me. When I got home, the sun was setting over the fields, painting the sky in gold and rust. I sat on the porch, watching the light move across the land, my father's land. The same land they'd mocked as dead. But now, contractors were scheduled to begin soil testing for renewable installations. A local university had reached out about leasing part of the property for research. And Dean had already uncovered hospital forms proving Dad's clear mental state during the transfers. Every thread they tried to pull was looping into a noose of their own making. For the first time in years, I felt something rising inside me, not revenge, but justice. Quiet, patient, unstoppable. One night, near midnight, I drove to the cemetery. The moonlight spilled over the gravestones, soft and silvery. I knelt beside my father's name. The marble was cool beneath my hand. "I think I finally understand you," I whispered. "You didn't just want me to protect the land. You wanted me to protect what's right." The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment I could swear I heard his voice again, that steady, grounded tone he used when he was proud of me. "You did good, son." I stayed there a while, letting peace settle where anger once lived. When I stood up, I knew the next phase had begun. The planning wasn't just about land anymore, it was about restoring balance. Because some truths deserve to be seen, not whispered. And the next time my siblings saw me, I wouldn't be the quiet caretaker they pitied. I'd be the man their conscience couldn't outrun. Justice doesn't rush. It studies, it listens, and when it moves like thunder after long silence. The next morning, I sat at my father's desk, the same oak one he'd used to write his sermons, taxes, and letters to the editor. I ran my hand across the grooves in the wood, feeling the indentations of decades of decisions made here. The sunlight filtered through the curtains in narrow bands, cutting the dust into golden threads. It felt sacred, somehow. I opened my notebook and wrote one word across the first page: strategy. Underneath it, I wrote the names of my siblings. Then I added the question that would guide everything that followed. What do they value more than truth? For Mark, it was reputation. He'd built his whole identity on being the successful one, the family's shining example who'd left the small town for real success. His LinkedIn page read like a love letter to himself. His life depended on appearances. For Elena, it was control. She couldn't stand the idea of being left out, of not pulling the strings. Her pride was her compass, and she'd rather burn down the house than admit she'd lost power inside it. Once I understood that, their vulnerabilities weren't mysteries anymore, they were coordinates. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted them to destroy their own illusions. So I began to plan. I hired a forensic accountant, a man named Ralph Monroe, ex-IRS investigator with a voice like gravel and eyes like math. He didn't ask many questions, just listened as I explained the situation. "I'm not accusing them of anything," I said. "I just want transparency." He smirked. "People who say that usually already know something." Maybe I did. Ralph began digging through financial trails, old estate taxes, transfers, shared accounts from when Dad was still alive. A few weeks later, he came back with a thick file. "Your brother's been moving money," he said, tapping the folder. "Used Dad's name on some of the earlier property appraisals for leverage loans. Technically, it was legal until the day your father signed everything to you. After that, it wasn't." I leaned back in my chair. "And my sister?" He flipped a few pages. "She signed as witness on a document she wasn't present for. That's perjury if it ever goes to court." I nodded slowly. "Keep copies of everything." He smiled. "I already have." Next, I reached out to a local journalist, Claire Henderson, who'd grown up 2 grades below me. She ran the community column, now the kind people read between sips of morning coffee. "Claire," I said, "I don't want a story about conflict. I want a story about loyalty, what it looks like when no one's watching." She raised an eyebrow. "You mean your story?" I smiled. "Not mine. My father's. I just happened to be in it." We spent hours walking the property as she took notes, recording my recollections of caring for Dad, the nights I sat by his bed, the letters he wrote, the land he refused to abandon. I showed her the notebook he'd left me, the deeds, the letter that began, "If you're reading this, it means they're already trying to make you doubt yourself." She didn't say much, but her eyes shimmered by the end. "I'll write it the way it deserves," she said softly. When the article came out a week later, it wasn't sensational, it was honest. The headline read, "A Son's Promise: How One Man's Loyalty Outlived the Gossip." It spread faster than any rumor my siblings had ever started. People I hadn't spoken to in years stopped me in town, shaking my hand, saying, "Your dad raised a good man." Even the pastor mentioned loyalty in his next sermon. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. They had built their story on lies. I just held up a mirror. By the time the next court hearing arrived, my siblings were furious. Mark had hired a new lawyer, loud, theatrical, confident. He strutted into the courtroom like he was auditioning for a movie. Mr. Williams, calm as ever, simply adjusted his glasses and handed the judge a binder labeled Callahan Estate, Supplementary Evidence. Inside were Ralph's reports, financial irregularities, unauthorized withdrawals, and false witness signatures. When Mark's lawyer opened it, I saw his face tighten. He whispered urgently into Mark's ear, Elena tried to maintain her composure, but I could see her pulse fluttering at her throat. The judge looked over the documents quietly, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Callahan," he said, addressing Mark, "were you aware of these transactions?" Mark's mouth opened, then closed again. "Those were investments. My father knew." Mr. Williams stood. "Your Honor, those transactions occurred months after the legal transfer of property to my client." Meaning, his father was no longer the owner. Silence filled the room like a held breath. The judge leaned back. "That's a serious violation, Mr. Callahan. I suggest you and your counsel proceed carefully." That was the first time I saw fear crack Mark's confidence. And as for Elena, she refused to look at me for the rest of the hearing. After that day, I didn't need to fight. They were fighting themselves. Rumors turned against them. People who once believed their story began whispering a new one that greed had blinded them. Mark's company even suspended him pending ethical review after word got out about the property scandal. I didn't leak anything. I didn't have to. Truth has a way of finding its own voice once it's given oxygen. At home, I kept working the land, repairing fences, planting young oaks along the northern field, painting the barn white again. Each brushstroke was an act of restoration. One evening, as I painted, I saw headlights approaching down the gravel road. It was Elena. She stepped out of the car slowly, no makeup, no pretense. For the first time in years, she looked like my sister again. "Joseph," she said softly. I set down the brush. "Evening." She hesitated. "I didn't come to argue." "Good." She looked around, eyes moist. "This place, it feels different now. Alive." "It always was," I said. "You just stopped visiting." Tears gathered in her eyes. "We thought you stayed because you had nowhere else to go." "I stayed because I knew what was worth staying for." She nodded slowly. "Mark won't forgive you." "I'm not asking him to." She swallowed hard. "You won't forgive us either, will you?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I already did. But forgiveness doesn't rebuild trust. That's your part." She nodded again, stepped back, and whispered, "You really are Dad's son." When she drove away, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and peace. Because forgiveness, I learned, isn't surrender, it's release. After months of hearings, the final verdict came swiftly. The judge upheld the validity of the will, dismissed all contesting claims, and added a statement I'll never forget. "This court recognizes not only legal ownership but moral integrity. Mr. Joseph Callahan's stewardship of his father's estate reflects values our community should remember." I didn't smile. I just nodded. As we left the courthouse, the sunlight caught the courthouse steps, and for the first time, it felt like my father was walking beside me. But justice wasn't just about winning. It was about what came next. That evening, I sat on the porch and began drafting a plan for the future, a project I called the Callahan Legacy Initiative. Half of the southern fields would be converted into a solar and wind pilot farm. The profits would fund scholarships for local students pursuing environmental studies and agricultural science kids like I once was, too broke to leave, too rooted to abandon home. The remaining acres would stay preserved untouched, natural, free. I wanted the land to speak long after I was gone. Because that's what my father meant when he said, "Whoever keeps it alive deserves it." Weeks later, as the project gained attention, Claire returned for a follow-up story. She stood beside me near the barn, the sunset turning the air amber. "You know," she said, "your siblings might never admit you were right." I smiled. "They don't have to. The land already did." She scribbled that down and laughed. "You talk like a man who's made peace with ghosts." Maybe I have. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of fresh paint and wildflowers. Claire glanced toward the house. "What will you do now?" I looked out over the horizon, where the oaks we'd planted were swaying softly, live, quietly, the way truth does after it wins. Mark never apologized. He couldn't. Pride is a heavier chain than guilt. But I heard through the grapevine that he sold his house and moved to another city. Elena sent me a letter months later. It said, "You were right. We confused absence with freedom. Thank you for staying when we didn't." I kept that letter in the same drawer as my father's. Not out of pride, but as a reminder that even the coldest hearts can thaw under the light of truth. That night, as I closed the gate and looked up at the stars, I whispered, "It's done, Dad." The sky was quiet, but in that silence I felt everything: the ache, the relief, the peace that comes only after a storm you never wanted but had to endure. Because loyalty doesn't shout when it wins. It just keeps building. And justice, real justice, doesn't come to punish. It comes to restore balance. The courthouse smelled of dust and varnish the morning of the final hearing. Light streamed through tall windows, slicing the air into golden beams that drifted across the wooden benches like silent witnesses. I sat there alone, calm in a way that only truth can make you calm. Across the aisle sat Mark and Elena. They looked smaller than I remembered. Not because they'd shrunk, but because pride had finally run out of posture. Their lawyer was gone. He'd withdrawn a week earlier when new evidence surfaced that Mark had falsified financial statements during the contestation. When the bailiff called my name, I stood. My boots clicked against the floor, steady as a metronome. The judge's eyes met mine, tired, kind, unafraid of silence. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "this case has gone on long enough. Do you wish to add anything before we close?" I cleared my throat, the words rising from a place that felt deeper than lungs. "Yes, Your Honor. I just want to say that this was never about property. It was about promise. My father made one, and I kept it." I turned slightly toward my siblings. 4 years, I waited for someone to show up. I waited through holidays, storms, birthdays. I believed family meant presence, not bloodlines. And when I finally realized I was the only one left holding the promise, I didn't feel special. I felt scared. But I stayed. The courtroom was still except for the distant ticking of the wall clock. I took a slow breath. Loyalty doesn't need an audience. It just needs endurance. The judge nodded once. "That will be on record." He shuffled the final papers, then spoke the words that ended 2 years of torment. "This court affirms the legality of all transfers to Mr. Joseph Callahan. Case dismissed." A gavel struck wood. A sound sharp enough to cut the air, and yet to me, it sounded like mercy. Outside, the town square was buzzing. Reporters leaned over railings, cameras flashing. Claire stood near the fountain with her notepad, watching as I stepped down the marble stairs. Mark followed a few steps behind. "You think this is over?" he snapped. His voice was brittle, like glass about to give way. I turned to him. "It's been over for a long time, Mark. You just kept fighting the wrong man." He opened his mouth to argue, but words failed him. For the first time in my life, he had nothing left to say. Elena lingered behind him, eyes red but gentle. She whispered, "I'm sorry," and I believed her. That evening, I drove home in silence. The road curved through the same hills I'd driven 1,000 times, but they looked different now, wider somehow, as if the land itself had exhaled. When I reached the farmhouse, the porch light flickered once and steadied. I stepped out of the truck and just listened. Crickets sang. The wind rustled the new oaks. Somewhere far off, a coyote called into the night. I walked to the chair by the window, Dad's chair, and sat down. The last rays of sunset washed the room in amber. On the table lay both letters, his and Elena's. I placed them side by side. That's when I felt it, the shift from survival to peace. Because revenge ends when justice begins, and justice begins when the truth no longer needs defending. Weeks later, at the dedication ceremony for the new Callahan Renewable Field, the whole town gathered. Rows of solar panels glimmered beneath a pale blue sky, stretching across the southern acres that had once been called useless. A local pastor opened with prayer. Then the mayor handed me a plaque inscribed, "For faithfulness to legacy and land." I spoke briefly. This project isn't about energy. It's about endurance. My father believed the land rewards those who show up. Today, it's showing up for all of us. Applause rippled gently through the crowd. In the back, I saw Mark and Elena standing apart, quiet. They didn't clap, but they didn't leave. That was enough. When the ceremony ended, I walked over. Mark avoided my eyes. "Looks good," he muttered. "Thanks," I said. "It's yours too, you know. The name, not the ownership. The story." He nodded once, jaw tight, then walked away with shoulders heavier than any lost money could measure. Elena stayed. She looked around, blinking back tears. "He'd be proud." "I know," I said. "But I think he'd be even prouder if we finally stopped fighting ghosts." She smiled faintly, wiped her eyes, and whispered, "Maybe now we can." Over the next months, life found its rhythm again. I woke before dawn, brewed strong coffee, and watched the first light roll across the fields. The panels gleamed like quiet soldiers guarding something sacred. Sometimes I'd walk down to the pond and skim stones across the surface. The ripples moved outward, soft but certain proof that even small actions echo when the water's still enough. In those quiet mornings, I'd think about the years lost to anger and misunderstanding. And I realized something profound. Forgiveness isn't given once, it's practiced daily. Every time I chose silence over bitterness, I was choosing freedom. On the anniversary of my father's passing, I sat at his desk again and began writing my own letter, the one I'd want someone to find years from now. To whoever reads this. You'll hear a lot of talk about success and wealth. They'll tell you to chase what glitters. But remember this, loyalty shines in the dark, not under spotlights. It's what you do when no one will ever know. If you inherit anything from me, let it be patience. Let it be the courage to keep showing up, even when gratitude never comes. Because one day, the world will circle back, and you'll realize that what looked like loss was training. Every lonely act of love was a signature on the document of destiny. And when that day comes, stand tall, breathe deep, and thank the silence. It's where your strength was forged. Joseph Callahan. I sealed the letter, placed it beside my father's, and felt the circle close. That night, the sky turned the color of copper and fire. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, watching swallows dive through the fading light. Somewhere deep in the house, the clock ticked in steady rhythm, each sound a reminder that time heals what pride refuses to. The porch boards creaked. Mrs. Hunt walked up the steps with 2 jars of preserves. "Fig jam," she said. "Thought you might want some company." We sat there, 2 old neighbors listening to the world grow quiet. After a long pause, she said, "Your father would be proud." I smiled. He always said the land remembers who shows up. She patted my arm. "And you did." When she left, I looked back at the fields, now humming softly with the energy of new beginnings. The moon rose over them like a silver signature across the sky. I whispered, "It's all yours now, Dad." "Still alive." The wind answered with a gentle rustle through the trees. And I knew some victories don't come with cheers. They come with quiet evenings where peace finally fits like a well-worn coat. If you've listened this far, maybe you know something about staying when it's easier to leave. Maybe you've been mocked for choosing loyalty over ambition. Maybe you've held the hand of someone fading while the world forgot their name. If so, hear me now. You are not weak. You are the keeper of what's real. Because someday, when the noise fades and the lights dim, the only thing that still stands is the truth signed in silence. That's what my father taught me. That's what the land proved. And that's what I'll leave you with tonight. Loyalty signs documents when no one is watching. What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments below. Like this video if it touched something in you. And subscribe for more stories. Stories about loyalty, justice, and the quiet kind of courage that never stops showing up.